and that's actually handmade CGI. So everything you see is all handmade.
Some ideas don't arrive with a bang. They linger, quiet, persistent, almost uncomfortable. The kind that refuses to leave no matter how much logic tries to push it aside. Because deep down, something doesn't add up. Not in the skies we've watched for centuries, not in the stories we've laughed off too quickly, and definitely not in the questions science itself still can't answer. What if the real mystery isn't whether something is out there, but why we've spent so long pretending there isn't? And what happens when the people who were once dismissed suddenly start sounding a little too accurate to ignore? The fascination didn't begin with evidence, documents, or classified files. It began with a story, one that refused to behave like fiction. Long before investigations, organizations, or debates, there was a moment. A balcony, a quiet evening, two grown men staring into the sky as something impossible tore across the horizon. Not drifting, not hovering, but moving with a kind of intent that didn't belong to anything familiar. A perfectly shaped disk, metallic, reflective, and most disturbingly, alive in motion. One of those men had military experience. He understood aircraft. He knew how machines behaved in the sky. And whatever he saw that night didn't follow any of those rules. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't exaggerate it. He remembered it, clearly, consistently, and without hesitation. But no one believed him. That's where the real story begins. Because it's one thing to hear about something strange. It's another to watch someone you trust describe it with absolute certainty while everyone else treats it like a joke. That disconnect, that moment where reality and perception don't align, is what plants the seed. Not curiosity, but doubt. Not about the story, but about why people refuse to take it seriously. And once that seed is planted, it grows quietly. At first, it looks harmless. Books, articles, late-night reading. Trying to make sense of scattered pieces of information that don't quite fit together. Not obsession, just interest. But over time, patterns begin to emerge. Recurring shapes, similar descriptions, accounts separated by decades yet eerily consistent. And then comes the realization, this isn't just a collection of random stories. There's structure here. That realization changes everything. Because once you cross that line, you're no longer just reading, you're searching. That search eventually leads to organizations like Mutual UFO Network, better known as MUFON. Not some fringe group chasing fantasies, but a structured network attempting to document, analyze, and investigate sightings with a level of discipline most people wouldn't expect. Joining something like that at a young age isn't just unusual, it's isolating. Because outside of that world, the reaction is immediate and predictable. Mockery, dismissal, distance. It creates a strange duality. One life where everything appears normal, and another where questions are constantly being asked, quietly, in the background. A split identity between curiosity and acceptance, between wanting answers and wanting to belong. And for a while, belonging usually wins. The interest fades in and out. Life takes over. Social pressure builds. Conversations shift. Because the moment you bring up something like UFOs in a normal setting, everything changes. The room shifts. People stop listening and start judging. So you learn to stay quiet. But here's the problem with curiosity. It doesn't disappear. It waits. Every documentary, every unexplained sighting, every strange headline pulls you back in. Not because you want it to, but because something about it still doesn't make sense. And eventually, you stop resisting it. That's when things start to evolve. Because over time, the conversation itself begins to change. What was once considered absurd slowly becomes discussable, not proven, not accepted, but no longer instantly dismissed. And that shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, almost invisible at first, a slow transition from ridicule to cautious curiosity. The kind of shift you don't notice while you're inside it, but when you look back, it's impossible to ignore. A major turning point came with the USS Nimitz UFO incident, a case that forced the conversation into a space it had never fully occupied before. This wasn't a random witness. This involved trained military personnel, advanced radar systems, and objects performing maneuvers that defied known physics. And more importantly, it was acknowledged. Not explained, but acknowledged. That distinction matters. Because for decades, the entire topic lived in the shadows of denial. But now, something had changed. Governments weren't confirming alien life, but they were admitting that something unexplainable was being tracked, recorded, and studied. That alone reshaped the conversation. Suddenly, it wasn't just enthusiasts or researchers talking about it. It was mainstream media, intelligence officials, defense departments. The same institutions that once avoided the topic were now cautiously stepping into it. And with that shift came something even more important: permission. Permission to ask questions without immediate ridicule. Permission to explore possibilities without being dismissed. But even then, there were levels to the conversation. At the surface, it's easy to agree on one thing: the universe is vast. Statistically, the idea that life exists elsewhere is not only possible, it's likely. That's a comfortable discussion. It fits within scientific reasoning. It doesn't challenge belief systems too aggressively. But the moment you go deeper, everything changes. Because now you're not just asking if life exists somewhere out there. You're asking if it's been here. And that's where the line gets drawn. Because that idea introduces consequences. Technological, political, philosophical. It challenges not just science, but control, information, power structures. And suddenly the question isn't just about existence, it's about access. Who knows? Who doesn't? And more importantly, why? That's the layer where things become complicated. Because while the public conversation has evolved, clarity hasn't followed at the same pace. Instead, what we're left with is a fragmented landscape. Pieces of information scattered across decades, testimonies that align in some areas and contradict in others. Whistleblowers, skeptics, officials, all speaking but rarely agreeing. And in the middle of all that noise, one thing becomes clear. There is a phenomenon, not fully understood, not fully explained, but undeniably present. Objects are being tracked, encounters are being reported, data is being collected, and yet no definitive answers are being given. That tension between acknowledgement and explanation is what keeps the mystery alive, because it creates a paradox. If nothing is happening, why is it being tracked? And if something is happening, why don't we know what it is? That question doesn't fade, it intensifies, especially when you start looking at the patterns behind the information, the timing of disclosures, the language used by officials, the careful balance between revealing just enough and withholding everything else. It doesn't feel random, it feels controlled. And that's where curiosity turns into investigation. Because once you start paying attention, you realize something else. This isn't just about sightings or stories anymore. It's about narrative. Who controls it? Who shapes it? And who benefits from keeping it just out of reach? And maybe, just maybe, that's been the real story all along. You don't just find data, you find individuals, personalities, voices, each carrying their own version of the truth, shaped by experience, bias, and sometimes something much deeper. And among those voices, some stand out more than others, not because they're universally believed, but because they refuse to disappear. One of the most polarizing figures in this space is Bob Lazar, a name that instantly divides the room. For some, he's a whistleblower who revealed one of the most significant secrets in modern history. For others, he's a story that doesn't hold under scrutiny. And for decades, that divide has only grown wider. But here's where things get interesting. Despite all the criticism, all the attempts to discredit him, and all the inconsistencies people point out, parts of his story keep resurfacing. Not as speculation, but as echoes. Because over time, elements he described, technology, craft behavior, propulsion concepts, have started appearing in conversations from completely different sources. Government officials, intelligence insiders, military testimonies, people who, on paper, should have no connection to him, yet somehow sound familiar. Not identical, but close enough to make you pause. That's not proof, but it's not nothing either. And this is where the real tension begins. Because the problem isn't just whether someone like Lazar is telling the truth, it's that the system around him makes it almost impossible to verify anything cleanly. Information is incomplete, records are missing, claims are extraordinary, but so are the circumstances surrounding them. It creates a situation where both sides feel justified. Believers point to consistency over time. Skeptics point to gaps in evidence. And both arguments hold weight. That's what makes this space so difficult to navigate. Because you're not dealing with clear answers. You're dealing with layered uncertainty. Now add another layer to that. Imagine trying to reconstruct something that doesn't officially exist. That's exactly what led to the creation of what would eventually be known as Project Gravitator. Not as a theory, not as a discussion, but as a physical attempt to visualize something that had only ever been described. The idea itself sounds simple: take a reported craft and recreate it. But in practice, it's anything but. Because there are no blueprints, no confirmed materials, no verified dimensions, just testimony. And testimony, no matter how detailed, is still filtered through human perception. So the challenge becomes something much deeper than design. It becomes translation. Translating memory into structure, translating description into geometry, translating something unseen into something tangible. And to do that, you need more than creativity. You need precision. This is where the process shifts from curiosity into engineering. Every surface, every curve, every reflection of light has to be questioned. You're constantly questioning whether the flaw is in the design or in your understanding. That process alone took years. Not because of indecision, but because accuracy demanded it. And accuracy wasn't negotiable. Because the goal wasn't to make something that looked convincing. It was to make something that could stand up to scrutiny. That's why the project expanded. What started as a simple model turned into an entire environment. Because context matters. A craft doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in space, in scale, in interaction with its surroundings. So if you're going to recreate it properly, you don't just build the object, you build the world around it. That meant constructing entire environments digitally: hangars, landscapes, textures, lighting conditions. Not as artistic interpretations. The process wasn't straightforward. Rendering environments at that scale required immense computational power, custom workflows, even writing new code to optimize performance. What to prioritize, what to adjust, what to rebuild from scratch. And sometimes, what to accept. One of the most unexpected challenges came from something that shouldn't have been a problem at all: distance. Up close, the craft looked incredibly real. Every detail aligned, every reflection behaved correctly. It felt grounded. But as soon as you stepped back, something changed. It lost that realism. It started to feel off. At first, it seemed like a technical flaw, a rendering issue, a lighting inconsistency, something that needed fixing. But then came the realization that shifted everything. That effect matched the original description. The craft itself wasn't supposed to look real from a distance. It wasn't meant to behave like a conventional object under observation, which meant the problem wasn't actually a problem. It was accuracy. And that created a dilemma, because audiences expect consistency. If something looks real up close, it should look real from far away. That's how our perception works. But this wasn't following those rules. So the team had to find a balance, staying true to the description while still maintaining visual credibility. Not too perfect, not too artificial, just enough to feel real, without breaking the illusion. That balancing act became one of the most delicate parts of the entire project. Because now, it wasn't just about building something accurate, it was about presenting it in a way people could accept. And that's where the deeper realization comes in. This entire subject isn't just limited by evidence, it's limited by perception. What people are willing to believe, what they're comfortable accepting, and how far they're willing to go before they step back and say, that's too much. Because the moment something crosses that invisible line, it stops being considered and starts being rejected. Not because it's false, but because it feels impossible. And maybe that's the biggest barrier of all. And that's where everything starts to converge. Technology, testimony, perception, and something far more uncomfortable than uncertainty. Because the deeper you go into this subject, the less it feels like a mystery waiting to be solved, and more like a system designed to never fully resolve. Not because the answers don't exist, but because revealing them might create consequences no one is ready to deal with. Think about it. For decades, the biggest question has always been, are we alone? But that question on its own is safe. It lives in philosophy, in science, in curiosity. The real disruption begins when the question changes. Not, are we alone? But what if we were never alone, and someone already knows? That shift transforms everything. Because now it's no longer just a scientific discussion. It becomes political, strategic, dangerous. And that's exactly why the idea of full disclosure, real, undeniable, globally accepted disclosure, feels so unlikely. Not impossible, but impractical. Because for something like that to happen, it wouldn't just require evidence. It would require alignment. Governments, militaries, intelligence agencies, corporations, media, every major system that operates on information control would need to either agree or lose control. And historically, systems don't give up control easily. especially not when the stakes are this high. Because if even a fraction of these claims are true, if there is technology that doesn't belong to us, that operates beyond our current understanding, then it's not just a discovery, it's an imbalance. And imbalance creates vulnerability. Imagine a world where it's confirmed that a specific country or a specific group has access to something far beyond conventional technology. Something that could redefine energy, propulsion, defense, even time and space as we understand it. Because this wouldn't be about advancement, it would be about control. That's why the idea of disclosure isn't just complicated, it's risky. Not just for governments, but for everyone. Because information like that doesn't stay contained, it spreads. And once it spreads, it creates reactions. Some predictable, some not. And that's where another layer of this conversation comes into focus: timing. Because if you look closely, the way information has been released over the years doesn't feel random. It feels measured, slow, controlled, almost like a pressure valve, releasing just enough to prevent explosion, but never enough to reveal the full picture. You see it in media coverage, you see it in official statements, you see it in how certain terms are used, carefully, deliberately, often avoiding definitive language. Unidentified, aerial phenomena, unknown origin. Words that acknowledge something without committing to what it actually is. That's not accidental, that's strategy. Because as long as something remains undefined, it remains manageable. The moment it's defined, it becomes real. And reality demands response. Now add another factor into this equation: technology. Not the kind being discussed in classified programs, but the kind sitting in everyone's hands right now. Artificial intelligence. We're living in a time where visual evidence, once considered the strongest form of proof, is becoming the weakest. Because anything can be created, anything can be manipulated, anything can look real without being real. That changes the entire dynamic. Because now, even if something genuine appears, clear footage, undeniable imagery, it doesn't automatically convince people. It gets questioned, analyzed, debunked, or dismissed entirely. Not because it's fake, but because it could be. And that uncertainty works both ways. It protects the public from deception, but it also protects the truth from being fully accepted, which creates a strange paradox. We have more tools than ever to capture reality, and yet, reality has never been harder to prove. That's the environment this entire topic now exists in, a space where information is abundant, but certainty is rare. And in the middle of all that noise, projects like this film attempt to do something different. Not prove everything, not convince everyone, but anchor at least one part of the conversation in something tangible, something visual, something structured. Because while debates will continue, arguments will persist, and opinions will remain divided, there's still value in creating a reference point, a baseline, something that says, if this is what was described, this is what it would look like. Not imagination, not exaggeration, but reconstruction. And that matters. Because for the first time, instead of just hearing about it, you can see it, walk through it, experience it in a way that words alone could never deliver. And whether you believe the story behind it or not, that experience forces a different kind of engagement. It moves the conversation out of abstraction and into something almost physical. And maybe that's the real significance of this moment. Not that we've found definitive answers, but that we're getting closer to asking better questions. Because the truth is, this subject was never just about UFOs. It was never just about aliens. It was about how we respond to the unknown, how we process information that challenges our understanding, without fully exploring what's in front of us. Some people will watch this and see confirmation. Others will see speculation. Some will walk away convinced. Others will walk away unconvinced. And that's fine, because belief was never the objective. Engagement is, thinking is, questioning is. Because the moment people stop asking questions, that's when the real problem begins. So instead of asking you to believe anything, here's something far more important. Stay curious, stay skeptical, but most importantly, stay open. Because whether this story leads to something extraordinary or something far more grounded, one thing is certain. We are only seeing a fraction of the full picture. And that picture is still being drawn. If this made you pause, even for a second, if it challenged something you thought you were sure about, then you're exactly where you need to be. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think this is all just a carefully constructed illusion, or are we slowly being prepared for something much bigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring ideas that sit right on the edge of reality, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, because this conversation, it's just getting started.